finally, you rarely get anti-war voices on any cable news network. You rarely get, an anti-war voice in the New York Times. If there are anti-war voices, they get fired. Phil Donahue got fired from MSNBC in 2002 for being the lone critic of the Iraq War. You get ostracized from the corporate media if you're anti-war. And they don't, if Trump bombs Syria, if they never have anyone on to say, this is not a good thing. If Trump wants to take troops out of Syria, which he's already moonwalking away from, which I did yesterday, you rarely have anyone on saying, well, maybe this is a good idea, other than Rand Paul. And they go after him for saying that. So an NBC, a long-time NBC journalist, just left NBC and on his way out wrote a scathing, a scathing condemnation of NBC. And basically they're cheerleading for war and 24/7 Trump circus, as this reporter at NBC put it. You rarely hear anybody inside a network, probably because they want to keep their jobs, because they don't care about journalism, they care about money. You never hear a whistleblower within a corporate media outlet basically saying what we all know. These are the stenographers, and NBC and all these outlets are essentially public relations for the military-industrial complex, and that is what Bill Arkin has basically written. So Bill Arkin was a long-time reporter for NBC News. I'll read you just a little bit. Arkin has worked for NBC on and off for 3 decades, sometimes as a military analyst, sometimes as a reporter and consultant. He described himself as a scholar at heart, and he has authored numerous books about national security, most recently Unmanned, subtitled Drones, Data, and the Illusion of Perfect Warfare. So this is a guy who's been there for quite a while and apparently knows a lot about the military, and he's leaving. So he wrote a scathing memo. I'm actually going to read it to you almost in full because I think I read it and I really feel this is how a lot of people that work at these places feel, but because they have families, because they don't want to take a risk, because they don't really have any moral courage, they stay. But this is a really, really powerful piece, so I'm going to read it to you. January 4th is my last day at NBC News, and I'd like to say goodbye to my friends, hopefully not for good. This isn't the first time I've left NBC, but this time the parting is more bittersweet. The world and the state of journalism in tandem crisis. My expertise, though seeming to be all the more central to the challenges and dangers we face, also seems to be less valued at the moment. And I find myself completely out of sync with the network, being neither a day-to-day reporter nor interested in the Trump circus. And this is Bill Arkin. And I will put this link here to what I'm reading in Super Chat, so you have it to read along if you'd like, because I know the screen is a little blurry. So there is the link if you want to read along with me. His name is Bill Arkin, and he's been with NBC for 3 decades. I first started my association with NBC 30 years ago, feeding Cold War stories to Bob Windrum and Fred Francis at the Pentagon. I became an on-air analyst during the 1999 Kosovo War, continuing to work thereafter with nightly news, delighting and oftentimes annoying in my peculiar position of being a mere civilian amongst the generals and former government officials. A scholar at heart, I also found myself an often lone voice that was anti-nuclear and even anti-military. Anti-military for me meaning opinionated, but also highly knowledgeable. Somewhat akin to a movie critic, loving my subject, but also not shy about making judgments regarding the flops and the losers. When the attacks of 9/11 came, I was called back to NBC. I spent weeks on air and off air talking about Al-Qaeda and the various wars we were rushing into, arguing that air power and drones would be the centerpiece, not troops. In the new martial environment, where only one war cry was sanctioned, I was out of sync then as well. I retreated somewhat to writing a column for the Los Angeles Times But even there, I had to fight editors who couldn't believe that there would be a war in Iraq. And I spoke up about the absence of any sort of strategy for actually defeating terrorism, annoying the increasing gaggles of those who seem to accept that a state of perpetual war was a necessity. I thought then that there was great danger in the embrace of process and officialdom over values and public longing. And I wrote about the increasing power of the national security community long before Trump and, quote, the deep state became an expression. I produced one ginormous investigation, Top Secret America, for the Washington Post. And I wrote a nasty book, American Coup, about the creeping fascism of Homeland Security. Ooh, I like American Coup because we're status coup. He wrote American Coup about the creeping fascism of Homeland Security. Looking back now, they were both harbingers for what President Obama and then Trump faced in terms of largely failing to make enduring change. Somewhere in all of that, and particularly as the social media wave began, it was clear that NBC, like the rest of the news media, could no longer keep up with the world. Well, they also didn't want to keep up with the world. Added to that was the intellectual challenge of how to report our new kind of wars when there were no real fronts and no actual measures of success. To me, there is also a larger problem. Though they produce nothing that resembles actual safety and security, the national security leaders and generals we have are allowed to do their thing unmolested. Despite being at, quote, war, no great wartime leaders or visionaries are emerging. There is not a soul in Washington who can say that we have won or stopped any conflict. And though there might be the beloved perfumed princes in the form of the Petraeuses and Wesley Clarks, or the so-called warrior monks like Mattis and McMaster, we've had more than a generation of national security leaders who sadly and fraudulently, keyword, fraudulently, have done little of consequence. And yet we and others embrace them, even the highly partisan formers who masquerade as analysts. We do so ignoring the empirical truth of what they have wrought. There is not one county in the Middle East. I don't know if he meant country or county. It's spelled county. In the Middle East that is safer today than it was 18 years ago. Indeed, the world becomes ever more polarized and dangerous. As perpetual war has become accepted as a given in our lives, I'm proud to say that I've never deviated in my argument at NBC or at my newspaper gigs, that terrorists will never be defeated until we better understand why they are driven to fighting. This was the part that got me the most. So I've been saying this forever, and I'm accused of, stop defending terrorism, Jordan. It's because they hate America. It's because they hate America. That's why they fight. No. They hate America because we invade their countries and occupy their countries and murder their brothers and sisters and husbands and wives. That's why they hate America. Would you like it if an occupying army came into your city or town and just stayed forever? Seized your government, seized your land, stole your natural resources, stole your minerals? This idea, the Bush crowd, they hate us for our freedom. No, they hate you because you won't leave them alone. You won't leave these countries alone. And we go to these countries under this facade, this total sales job and complete con of spreading democracy, of, unleashing freedom for those in Iraq and Afghanistan, of liberating them. They'll treat us as liberators, we were said. No, they'll treat us as occupiers and invaders because that's what we are. Now, that doesn't condone terrorism. Terrorism is inexcusable in any form. Two wrongs don't make a right. But until we as a country realize terrorism is an idea, it's not an army, it's an idea fought by an army. But why do they want to hurt us. We don't think about it. We just try and kill them, and don't realize when you take one out, there's another waiting in the wings. They just regenerate and regenerate and regenerate because the idea of hatred to America persists. So this guy is hitting it right on its head. Seeking refuge, I'm proud to say that I never deviated in my argument at NBC or at my newspaper gigs that terrorists will never be defeated until we better understand why they are driven to fighting. And I have maintained my central view that air power, in its broadest sense, including space and cyber, is not just the future, but the enabler and the tool of war today. And by the way, that air power he's talking about is the United States refueling Saudi Arabia to drop bombs on Yemen school buses and Yemen weddings, killing tens of thousands of women and children, innocent women and children. Seeking refuge in its political horse race roots, NBC and others, meanwhile, report the story of war as one of Rumsfeld first the generals, as Wolfowitz first Shinseki, as the CIA versus Cheney, as the bad torturers first the more refined, about number of troops, a number of deaths, and even then, Obama first the Congress, poor Obama who couldn't close Guantanamo, or reduce nuclear weapons, or stand up to Putin because it was just so difficult. We have contributed to turning the world national security into this sort of political story. I find it disheartening that we do not report the failures of the generals and national security leaders. I find it shocking that we essentially condone continued American bumbling in the Middle East and now Africa through our ho-hum reporting. I'm a difficult guy, not prone to either protocol or procedure. Well, if I could afford you, I would love to hire this guy. And I give NBC credit that it tolerated me through my various incarnations. I hope people will say in the early days that I made Brokaw and company smarter about nuclear weapons, about air power, and even about Al-Qaeda. And I'm proud to say that I was also one of the few to report that there weren't any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and remember fondly presenting that conclusion to an incredulous NBC editorial board. I argued endlessly with MSNBC about all things national security for years, doing the daily blah, blah, blah in Secaucus, but also poking at the conventional wisdom of everyone from Chris Matthews to Hockenberry. And yet I feel like I failed to convey this larger truth about the hopelessness of our way of doing things, especially disheartened to watch NBC and much of the rest of the news media somehow become a defender of Washington and the system. Even without Trump, our biggest challenge as we move forward is that we have become exhausted parents of our infant and infantile social media children. And because of the cycle, we at NBC and all others in the journalism field suffer from a really bad case of not being able to ever take a breath. We are a long way from resolving the rules of the road in this age, whether it be with regard to our personal conduct or anything related to hard news. I also don't think that we are on a straight line towards digital nirvana. That is, that all of this information will democratize and improve society. I sense that there is already smartphones and social media fatigue creeping across the land, and my guess is that nothing we currently see, nothing that is snappy or chatty will solve our horrific challenges or of information overload or the role and nature of journalism. And I am sure that once Trump leaves center stage, society will have a gigantic media hangover. Thus, for NBC and for everyone else, there is challenge and opportunity ahead. I'd particularly like to think and write more about that. Thank you, Shell, for the $15 in Super Chat. Status Quo is one of the few outlets I can rely on these days for accuracy. Keep up the great work. That's why we do. That's why we do it. Thank you. There's a saying about consultants that organizations hire them to hear exactly what they want to hear. I'm proud to say that NBC didn't do that when it came to me. Similarly, I can say that I'm proud that I'm not guilty of giving my employers what they wanted. Still, the things this and most organizations fear most, variability, disturbance, difference, those things that are the primary drivers of creativity are not really the things that I see valued in the reporting ranks. I'm happy to go back to writing and commentary. This winter, I'm proud to say that I put the finishing touches on a 9/11 conspiracy novel that I've been toiling on for over a decade. It's a novel, but it meditates on the question of how to understand terrorists in a different way. And I'm undertaking 2 new book writing projects. One fiction about a lone reporter and his magical sources that hopes to delve into secrecy and the nature of television. There's lots of media critique out there, tons of analysis of leadership about and the presidency, but on the state of our national security, not so much. Hopefully I will find myself thinking beyond the current fire and fury and actually suggest a viable alternative. Wish me luck. I certainly, and here it is one more time in the super chat if you want to read that, I certainly wouldn't have read to you such a long thing if I didn't think it was truly remarkable, both in terms of its value for whistleblowing. I mean, essentially, he is one of the few corporate media people, corporate media reporters, corporate media journalists that has basically just pulled the entire veil. He is pulling the veil out from NBC and the corporate media. And he is essentially saying they are agents of the military-industrial complex. I mean, everything that he wrote, I didn't see it as much as him because I have not worked at a corporate media outlet as long as him. I was at Fox News for 2.5 years, which still gives me nightmares. And I was at MSNBC for a year, and then I wrote for a few digital media sites. So I saw that they loved war, but I didn't see it inside as a national security commentator or reporter. And the one thing that he said that I thought was really jarring was when he talked about, when he used to talk and pitch anti-nuclear, when he used to talk and pitch anti-war, when he used to talk and pitch, we need to have better relations and diplomacy with these countries. Every single editor, every single colleague, every single executive was all about war. Well, how can you get a, quote, neutral, unbiased, which isn't even a real thing, how can you get that if every person in the building is waving around their American flag and like, America's super duper awesome, and they got their G.I. Joe figures at their desk? How can you get truth? How can you get real journalism? How can you get actually having a debate about wars if every single person in the building, whether it's the New York Times, MSNBC, NBC, literally bows down to General Mattis and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and all of these people who have showed, as he says so eloquently, time and time again, have shown they don't have a strategy. They don't even have a real reason to be at war with these countries. That's why outlets like Status Quo exist, to counter this propaganda. Because let's call it what it is. Corporate media, corporate journalism is just an extension of the government. Yeah, they might kind of look like they're being tough on Trump. They're not being tough on Trump. They're being tough on Trump's tweets. They're being tough on how vile and out of the ordinary and not diplomatic Trump sounds. They're not being tough on Donald Trump's tax cuts for the rich. They're not being tough on Donald Trump and his inhumane, borderline genocidal border policy. Yeah, they cover it. Are they really holding him accountable? Are you kidding me? They're not being tough on the Republican Party and Donald Trump and some Democrats, essentially allowing children and their parents to be slaughtered all over America because the NRA gives them money. They're not tough on the issues that matter. They're not tough on the powerful when it comes to life or death. And they're certainly not tough on the politicians allowing our planet to burn while they cash their checks from ExxonMobil.